Hello, everyone, and this is going to be my latest political podcast. Today, I have another special guest. Last week, I had my friend Magana, and this week, I have my good friend Andrew, who's in one of my government classes. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Arrington. I'm a sophomore in the SIS, or the second year in the Global Scholars Program. I'm interested, I guess my focus areas are Russia and Eurasia, and I'm particularly interested in global security.
All right, so today we will be covering three topics, and those will be drones and drone policy within the United States and how we apply drones around the world. The second one will be NSA and all the recent revelations with spying, and Andrew's favorite topic will be the third one, which he will discuss right now.
Well, because of my interest in Russia and Eurasia, this is a really interesting time for. It's hard to say where to start because the drones, the NSA, the Syrian war, Russia, all these topics really tie into each other very nicely. But something that's been, in terms of Russian affairs, that's gotten a lot of attention in the past week is the trial of the Bolotnaya 12. This is a group of 12. I guess the Russian government would consider them political dissidents or people that were protesting Putin's election back in 2012, and just now they're getting around to trying these individuals. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the current Russian government's crackdown on free speech. Recently we've seen a lot of crackdown on LGBT issues and LGBT protests, but I mean, even going back to Putin's recent re-election, a lot are accusing him of trying to go back to, there's the American stigma of the Cold War, trying to go back to restore the Soviet Union, but I think it's more just a conservative government that he's taken charge of.
Sure, and we'll talk about more of that. That will be our third topic we discuss, and definitely, as you mentioned, Russia is becoming very big, and especially next year, it's going to be put in the spotlight with the 2014 Winter Olympics, which are going to be held there. So we'll hold off for that for the last issue because I want to spend most time. Andrew's very passionate about that. I know some of it, especially the LGBT issues, because I'm part of Amnesty International here at American. But first, let's go to our first topic, and that'll be drone policy in the United States. So I'll give a brief background, overview, and then I want to hear your thoughts. So we've definitely seen an escalation of drone policy, especially with the war on terror in the last decade or so. I mean, that's pretty indisputable. But the problem is now we're doing a lot of strikes that end up killing hundreds of civilians, sometimes indiscriminately. We know there are possibly civilians, and we still do it. And right now the UN released a report where they're looking into if the U.S. is violating international law by possibly having drones, in other people's borders that don't want them, such as, Yemen, as well as into some of the strikes that just seem to kill many civilians without, any thoughts or repercussions, even if it doesn't even kill the actual intended target. So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Drone policy is really interesting. I mean, when you think about it, the ability to have an American sitting, I don't know, in a base in somewhere at sea, maybe on an aircraft carrier or something.
I mean, there are a lot of them in Las Vegas too. That's crazy.
Right, even from America, waging the war on terror remotely, by remote control, it's saving American lives. Arguably, I don't know exactly the price figures, but I imagine it's less costly than outfitting, entire platoons of soldiers to go and putting them in harm's way. So from the American perspective, you can see where the president or the military advisors would like drone policy, but from I guess a human rights perspective, it is very dangerous because they're not always the most reliable intelligence, especially if we're pulling people out of the field. Human intelligence is the best, but if we're getting all of our intelligence from satellite photos, identifying targets, there's so much room for error. But I'm also curious. I haven't seen many official figures of how many civilians are killed by these drone strikes or how successful the drone strikes are. And I guess it makes sense that the U.S. government would be hesitant to declassify that data to dispel, any rumors about, or not rumors. I mean, it's known that drone strikes do go wrong or there's collateral damage and innocent people die. But it's understandable that the U.S. can't exactly always back up these claims or dispel these claims by releasing this sort of information.
Yeah, I agree. So from what I read, the UN report released just a few weeks ago said 400, I think, in the last year, looking at Pakistan, Yemen. So that's just this year, 400 civilian deaths. They're looking into that. So that's like a physical number. And as you mentioned, the U.S. Is very quick to downplay these numbers. And you're right. There's not much transparency either from the previous Bush administration or the current Obama administration. And as you mentioned, from a human rights perspective, I'd like to see some more transparency. Obviously, some of it is going to have to stay classified, but it would be nice to know at least some of the decision-making process, real information, because I think as a democratic nation, it's the responsibility of the government to let the people know exactly what it's doing.
Right, and I think that it ties into very nicely, kind of into not going there yet, but the NSA thing about the government kind of pulling back or being more conservative in the amount of information or the type of information that it allows the public access to. I think it's important that people are aware of what's going on in Congress in terms of the budgets and everything, but you have to ask yourself what is a security risk. At which point it's a security risk, and also the government is really dedicating itself to this war on terror. We've been dedicated to it since 2001. And if we were to have another Vietnam on our hands, the current administration's having enough problems now with we're finally, I guess in my opinion, pulling out of the recession. So our economic worries aren't as much, but we're still in Afghanistan, still facing terror attacks. With the recent fairly recent Boston marathon bombing. It's still a present threat. So the last thing we want is another, I don't know, Vietnam. So people up in arms in the U.S. protesting.
Yeah, I would argue that to a large extent Iraq was a very similar Vietnam in that there wasn't really a clear reason why we did it. We found out that the reasons behind it were flawed, just like there were no WMDs in Iraq, and later, comparing it back to Vietnam, we found out the Gulf of Tonkin situation was not what we thought it was. So definitely there's a history of government lying to us, especially when it comes to war, and I think that's why it's more important than ever on drone strikes. But other than the sort of moral issues behind it, it's also just practical to reduce unwarranted drone strikes. So obviously, if you're in like a firefight and it's like a pretty simple U.S. soldiers versus the enemy, and it's pretty clear cut, then I feel inappropriate use to use a strike. But if it's not a war zone and you simply do a strike because either just to shock the enemy or because maybe there's one guy but he killed up civilians, I think that actually hurts our security interests, because then the people get angry at us and they look at the United States and they look, why are they bombing us? Why are they killing innocent people? They say the whole reason to fight the Taliban, the U.S. is the Taliban does bad things, therefore we are justified to do what we're doing, and the whole reason Taliban does bad things is because they kill innocent people. And so if the U.S. does the same thing, it sort of means the Afghan people or Iraq people, who it may be, are very just likely to trust the government, as we saw with the grandmother getting killed and the family, and that boy saying he's afraid of clear skies because that means they're drones. So I think it could have some just military backlash as well as obviously moral repercussions.
Right, and not only military. Well, in the U.S., there are groups that say, absolutely, use drone strikes. It keeps our men off the ground. And then there are groups that say, well, drone strikes do, cause collateral damage. Grandmothers, grandmothers and children are killed. Just there is this collateral damage. But you have to ask, how successful are these drone strikes really? There's been a lot of coverage in the paper. I guess they're trying to take the attention off of the NSA scandal about the leading member of the Taliban in Pakistan was just killed by a drone strike and a couple of militants, and it was a relatively clean strike. There wasn't, to my knowledge, there wasn't any collateral damage. And the U.S. had a price tag of $5 million on this man's head, and he was able to, and the drones were able to take him out in one strike. That's successful. We didn't have to do any sort of black ops operation or.
What I did find interesting, though, was that is true, and I agree. Like I mentioned, there is a time and place for that. I'm not saying completely ban them. I'm just saying, re-examine their use. But I think in that same article that you sent me, did it say that they thought they had killed him in the past and they had to do it again? So it just shows like, okay, maybe on this strike they finally got him, but maybe they did strikes trying to kill him in the past and they didn't fail. So I think that's the problem. It's not like they were 1 for 1. They might have been 1 for 3 or 1 for 4. I don't know how many previous strikes there were. So I think that's one of the problems too.
Absolutely, and I mean every unsuccessful strike you have, you're potentially breeding a new generation of people who are, growing up with America not as a land of opportunity or Hollywood or like blonde actresses or things like that. You're growing up with people that hate the sky because American drones are flying over their houses, and I mean we are seeing as a direct reaction to the recent sort of surge in drone strikes, videos of people burning American flags in the streets, and you have to ask what is that doing to American safety? It's getting rid of key leaders, but something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree. It's just a very tricky situation, and as the article we were reading has mentioned that there are some peace talks trying to happen within the Middle Eastern region, but the more the United States does these sort of strikes, the less likely these peace talks are going to occur. And I feel, eventually there has to be peace. We can't just continually be in a war on terror. I mean, it's crazy to think it started in 2001 and now it's 2013, 12 years later, and it's still ongoing. So I think these policies need to be seriously re-examined. And I think the crazy thing is, at least it makes some sense at a bare level that we're using them in Iraq and Afghanistan since we're, quote unquote on war with them. But the fact that we're using them in sort of non-sanctioned countries such as Pakistan and Yemen sort of begs some serious, international law questions. Like, what if, there was, say, a Mexican criminal who was doing some drug operations in the U.S., and the Mexico government wanted to take him out, so they launched a drone strike, let's say in El Paso, Texas. And okay, so they kill this Mexican drug guy, but they kill some, innocent Americans as well. The outrage, I'd imagine, from Americans would be huge, and
absolutely.
our government would do so much. Yet, I feel there's a double standard where if we do the same exact thing with other countries that we're not at war with, the U.S. is not at war with Mexico, the U.S. is not at war with Yemen, that it's such a violation of international standards.
Definitely, and I think that drones are just becoming the replacement for soldiers. Basically, I mean, if the U.S. had, the U.S. on many occasions historically, if things are going wrong in a country or not favorable to the U.S., it'd send in the CIA, train some exiles to invade and start a revolution. I mean, Americans are so tired of. I mean, it's kind of going back to the whole Vietnam repeating, but Americans are so tired of war at this point, or at least seeing our soldiers go off to war. Americans are, I'd say for the most part, are more willing to see. I mean, nobody's willing to see the horrible pictures that are coming out of Pakistan, or to hear about the reports of people's relatives being killed by accident. But when it comes down to ours or theirs, it starts becoming a really tricky game.
Yeah, it's tough. It's definitely tough. And I think we're going to move on to NSA soon, but I'm just going to add a quick note and you can comment on that if you want. But I think at the end of the day, yeah, it's tough that, it becomes a very much your life, their life situation. But I think if, people are exposed to what's really going on and they start, trying to be more humanitarian, more human-esque, realize the suffering going on around the world, hopefully, the international community will kind of set everyone on the standard, hold the United States accountable, and make the drone strikes better. More targeted, less on innocent civilian, less try to do less casualties, more specific strikes, less collateral damage. And I think by examining these policies, we can hopefully reduce the number of innocent deaths.
I agree, definitely.
All right, so let's move on to the NSA, and I'm going to let you just open up with your thoughts on the whole situation. With the whole spying on foreign leaders or allies. It's pretty much, if you're a human being with an internet connection on this planet, you're probably being spied on by the NSA.
It's, in a word, it's ridiculous. I mean, the U.S. is not making any friends in the Middle East or South Asia, with its invasions and in sort of invasive policy, drone strikes and everything. We've discussed how that's those sort of sentiments that are bred But I mean, among our own allies, and not only were we, was it brought to the public's attention a vague idea of the extent to which the U.S. government was spying on its own people, but you start reading these articles about the U.S. spying on Germany, on Angela Merkel, and tapping millions and millions of phone records of French citizens, and it's frustrating, really, to think that the U.S. is causing such problems, with its enemies, and then spying on its friends.
Yeah, I completely agree. And apparently, from what I was reading, not only is it just like the leaders and just, like officials, in Germany or France, it's like the French and like German citizens. Like again, that's why like my point of like everyone with the internet connection is being spied isn't really that off far like the actual reality. Um, and obviously, as we mentioned, it's just a very violation of privacy, the Fourth Amendment, at least for U.S. citizens, and our international norms. But I also think it's also impractical too. It's just too much information. It's very hard to extrapolate anything from it. It didn't stop the Boston Marathon bombings. It's very hard. Most intel, is very shady. No one's very rarely does someone directly say, let's bomb this place. Usually it's, tangential evidence that you're not really able to pick apart. So I think it's also, as much as it's illegal, it's impractical as well.
Right. There are cases, and I'm sure there are many foiled terrorist plots that we just haven't heard of. It's the
That could be the case.
famous. I guess there's a famous saying, at least in the intelligence community, that you never hear about the successes, because it's like, why, if you foiled some huge terrorist plot, would you want to boast it to the public? Then terrorists are just going to say, oh, the CIA found out this way, we're not going to do that anymore. Or the CIA, the NSA, whoever it may be.
Yeah.
But even internationally, the NSA has cooperated with numerous international intelligence services. I know the British are one of them. The British equivalent of the NSA was assisting something. It was something like that. It wasn't the MI5 or the MI6, but it was another branch that. It's sort of like the NSA. They're mostly like code breaking and technical hacking computers, and working in collaboration with them into hacking into, or not hacking, but interfering or picking up Google transmissions, or Yahoo. I know was another major company that they tapped for information. But I mean, it has been successful to an extent, but it's it's the age-old question of privacy and security versus freedom. I mean, we're taking an entire class about that.
So I'm going to respond to that in two ways. So I'll get to the debate itself. I just want to make just another quick point that I understand the argument that obviously the successes are going to be more hidden. That's why you don't reveal this specific plot at this point. But at least numerically, you should be able to. I mean, I don't think a Taliban plot is they're gonna be effective. Like the CIA gave like a set number, like 52 or something. I mean, it might be arbitrary, obviously, or they could be lying, but at least like show us like how many. Obviously, you can't go into the details, but it doesn't seem like they can show that either. But as you mentioned, I'm sure. I mean, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that I'm sure there's some cases that have obviously been helped by this. But let me get to my second thought, and that's that. Even if there are some cases, I feel in this instance that privacy is more important because we already have so many bad things going on. Even if a few are caught, many bad things will continue with this spying program. And I think the invasion of liberty far outweighs any benefits from stopping some crimes because it's everyone's liberty, it's everyone's Fourth Amendment, and it's in the Constitution. And I just feel like if you continue on that pattern, it leads to a very bad slippery slope of taking away rights. And that happened largely starting with the Patriot Act and 9/11. And I feel like if we continue down this path, it's already bad, but it could get even worse. And I think that, in order to defend people's constitutional rights, the government should take a stand and stop the NSA spying.
I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like a lot of people are on the same page, or at least realizing now that, how far can we let the government go, to protect us, quote unquote, when, it's not like they're taking away our freedoms necessarily. I mean, they have scores of lawyers in the NSA that it's their job to look over, or just these different government spying agencies, I guess you could call them, that look over legislation and find the loopholes to see what they can legally do or what they can classify as security versus just blatant invasion of privacy. It's hard to say. I mean, at least for us, the classifications.
I agree, and that's why I'm against. I'm not. If the NSA gets a warrant, I'm completely fine with that. I mean, they're following the protocol. That's what you do. You get a warrant. It's when they don't, and it's for people that they have no probable cause in the mass surveillance that I'm against. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of I don't know what the exact numbers are, but at least a significant portion of Americans would probably agree with you and me. That at least the unwarranted part, the mass surveillance part, should definitely be stopped. It needs to be questioned. And the Congress came close. It was a close vote in the House, but unfortunately, the NSA won that. But I think in the coming years, the anger is going to pressure congressmen to do something about it. And so, as bad as the situation is now, I'm optimistic that in the future, maybe with the 2014 to 2016 elections, we'll get a Congress that kind of votes against unwarranted spying, and so I think that'll be a good safeguard, and that's why I think the 2014 and 16 elections are pretty important.
I feel like that's a common sentiment. There are certain, I don't know, I think people are still, in terms of drones, people are on the fence, but in terms of personal privacy, I feel like this has been a real sort of shock to the American public. There's certainly for days it's been this story about the NSA, that story about the NSA. The German Prime Minister, I guess is her title, is we're tapping her phone, we're tapping Google and Yahoo, people's personal social networking sites. And I mean, you were referencing the Bill of Rights, but I mean that's at least a protection of American citizens.
Yeah, and that's also why Americans care more, is that they themselves are being affected. It's their government, and more importantly, it's like they themselves are being spied on. Whereas the drones, they don't really see that. It's occurring in foreign lands.
Right, or I guess because I'm forever thinking about international policy and how U.S. interacts with foreign citizens, or citizens of the U.S. abroad, or just people of other nationalities. How does the U.S. draw the line between the privacy of its own citizens and the privacy of citizens of other countries? We've seen, or there was the whole controversy. There was an American citizen overseas in a terrorist camp, and we took him out with a drone strike.
Yeah.
Or how, if there's, foreign citizens, say, of someone in France, and they're plotting an attack on the U.S., why should the U.S. not step in and try to collect information about that individual, even if they're a French national?
Yeah.
Is that...
Well, I guess my thing would be, so here's the standard I would lay out to sort of answer your question. So if it's the U.S. spying on U.S. citizens, they have to get a warrant. I mean, that's pretty simple. Fourth Amendment covers that. So if it's, let's say they're spying on U.S. citizens. Okay, so let's take the U.S. and France example. So say the NSA is spying on an American citizen who's living in France, and this guy in France doesn't have any connections to France. So let's ignore dual citizenship or anything. So he's just a U.S. citizen in France. They still have to get a warrant because he still is a citizen and is guaranteed to that Fourth Amendment right. Now let's say it's a French guy in France. Okay, I think that the U.S. does not have jurisdiction over that person. However, they can coordinate with the French, intelligence or whatever, and if they get the approval, then they can go ahead. But the U.S. shouldn't be able to unilaterally spy on a French citizen in France without going through some sort of challenge. And I guess the last scenario is if there's a French guy in the United States. I would say that's the one exception where I think they don't have to get a warrant because it could pose an imminent threat. So that would be the standards I would lay out.
Right, and also, I mean, you have to think espionage organizations, or whatever you would call them. It seems like pretty much every branch of the FBI has a counter-terrorist unit. The CIA has a counterterrorism branch. They all have these certain frameworks that they have to, some have to work within a tighter framework. Like the FBI, you think of them more as doing domestic police work, whereas the CIA is essentially an agency that legitimizes spying. Spying is illegal. It has always been illegal. People, going back to ancient Egypt would be killed for spying. It's not legal. So, if you can say we're doing police work the FBI is doing police work, yes, you need a warrant, but I can see where, these legal loopholes that we were talking about earlier, if you're saying it's espionage or something for the sake of global security, do you need a warrant, especially for someone who's not an American citizen if they're living or currently residing overseas?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough question, and obviously it's cliche, but case by case basis is obviously what's needed. So as I mentioned, I think we all agree that in the first three scenarios that I mentioned, you should need some sort of warrant, or so that would So I guess the one loophole is what I mentioned, and it's an internal debate for me. But okay, say there's a French guy in the United States, and there's information that this guy could be plotting some sort of attempt. Now it's tough because he's in the United States territory, which I guess the U.S. has some jurisdiction, and I think if whatever spying organization, whether it be NSA or CIA or whatever, can show some sort of legitimate threat, then I think they should have to go through some warranting process. Maybe not a full warrant, but some probable cause. And again, like you mentioned, there's going to be loopholes, but I think any reform would be better than what we have now, and that's why I hope Congress in the future does pass some laws limiting it. Obviously, it's not going to end completely.
I agree, but again, it comes to national security. If we're doing these things in the interest of national security, is it in our interest to avoid the bureaucracy and have it passed to the highest level, or have one person appointed to approve, say, drone strikes, or approve tapping of individuals? Because as far as I know, I believe the president is briefed on every single drone strike before it happens, but he might not get all of the information, or he might not be as knowledgeable on certain security issues. So he might, thinking with the best intelligence we have, which we know, American intelligence isn't always the most reliable, Iraq.
Yeah.
But it's, so do we appoint people to deal with, drone strikes or specific tapping of individuals, or do we continue to hold the president liable? And I think saying we need warrants for all this, who's going to approve the warrants? Judges, and that would be bringing judges into matters involving top secret or very classified materials.
Yeah.
It could get very muddy very
it's
quick.
tough. I don't have the answers for all your questions. The one thing I will say though is that there are judges that are designed for this sort of things, and they existed pre 9/11 and stuff. So maybe going back to sort of that, where they needed more probable cause, would be good. And I personally don't know how much jurisdiction the president has over knowledge of the drone strikes. I know obviously they probably have to approve them, and they could stop them if they wanted. How much information, like you said, it's up in the air, and I don't know. But it definitely, the NSA and the drones both need to be re-examined and changed. I mean, there are obviously legitimate sides, the whole, as we mentioned, security versus privacy interests, but for the NSA, I think it's pretty clear that the current point that right now there needs to be more of a balance, and there has to be some reduction. The specific standards and how to go about that, I can't answer at this point. I'll let you make any final comments on that, and I think we should move on to the third topic.
Right. I mean, I don't think there's much I have to add on this. I think what you're saying, kind of in summary, or your points, I agree with. It's just it's a debate that needs to happen, and I think it really comes down to how involved do we want people in national security? How much input, I guess, from the public, or how far are people willing to go? There's a dozens of questions that we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah.
And I don't know
exactly. Actually, I've got one quick
to
question that I want to ask you
sure.
that's pretty controversial, and then we'll go into the topic.
Okay.
And it relates to all this. So what do you think of the whole Edward Snowden situation? Because we didn't even Edward Snowden situation. Yeah. Sorry, because we didn't even find out about this until of Snowden, and of course that launched the whole debate. That's how we knew about it. That's what's leading to the discussions like now. So what do you feel on the prosecution, statements of him? How do you feel on him on the hero traitor spectrum, so to speak?
That's a good question. I've been trying to keep myself out of the drama of the Edward Snowden.
If you don't want to answer, that's fine.
It's fine. I mean, I'm willing to discuss it briefly, but I think to an extent, I don't know exactly what he leaked, but from my understanding, he was leaking general things about the NSA is tapping this, he's tapping this. This is not right, or just things that people, would think that they were previous. Things that people felt comfortable saying online. All of a sudden they realized, no, the NSA is keeping track of this. I think I'm not sure it poses as much of a national security threat as it was portrayed. But at the same time, you can see where, if this guy had top secret clearance, he's clearly going out of his way to sort of jeopardize the operations of the government agencies that he works for. I think the U.S. The government or the administration sort of had to, in order to keep face, prosecute him, treat him as a traitor. In the international spectrum, I think he should be treated. I mean, at least in terms of the recent international spying scandals that have been revealed. It's with France. It sort of opened France's eyes to that. It exposed, the cooperation with Spain, cooperation with England, spying on Germany. I can see where the international community would sort of embrace Snowden as enlightening them, or at least opening their eyes to the fact that the enemy isn't necessarily just in the Middle East, but their friends are also in the U.S. are spying on them. So
Yeah, I agree.
that's all
I mean,
that's really all I have to say on that.
I'll just give a brief note that obviously I have a bias, and I think it's very good that he gave that information out, and I think he was strategic in what he chose. I don't think anyone's lives were at risk. He basically just said the NSA is spying, and then went more into details on how. But I think since, as I feel it's a abridgment of constitutional rights to do what the NSA is doing, I think it's good. I don't think he should be prosecuted, but obviously I have a bias, and this could be a big debate, so we'll move on to the third topic on just sort of like Russian politics and all the things going on there. So how about you go into the case you're talking about earlier and sort of the whole just Putin administration as a whole over the last few years?
Right. Russia and the U.S. This has been a pretty interesting time, especially in the past couple of months. I think every single little case that we hear about is just sort of building on sort of existing tensions. I think I mentioned this in the beginning of this podcast, the sort of stigma of Russia as being, sort of the Soviet Union rising again, or else the Russian Empire rising again. Russia's always kind of the bad guy of the East, and Americans still like to, they still like to see Russia as the bad guy of the East. It's their internal politics are backwards, and they're always spying on us. There was I think it was 2 years ago or something like that, a female Russian spy was caught in the U.S. and that it blew up. She was like a celebrity. I mean, they were having photo shoots with her, just because it's so mysticized. I don't know.
I think that you mentioned like we're still caught in this idea of Russia as the as the Cold War enemy, so to speak. There's residual effects of that sort of depiction. I mean, there's no longer a Soviet Union, but we still sort of imagine that there is, and we call Russia that. But I think with the Putin administration more specifically, I think there's especially more fears because this guy was ex-KGB. He was a big part of the internal politics that the Americans always criticize of Russian politics. But more specifically in terms of Russia today, I think the anti sort of political protests going on, especially politically, that they're cracked down, don't make Russia look really good because it's very Cold War-esque, and many older Russians are feeling this, and the Soviet Union existed, not too long ago. People have lived. Many people alive today have experienced that, or parents. So, I think it's just raising a lot of these, hidden fears.
Definitely, I think there's people aren't afraid of Russian communism as much anymore. I mean, in the 90s, when Russia was going through a fairly rapid and really hard transition from a command economy to a free market economy, there was a lot of turmoil, at least initially. So the Russian Communist Party was in control of the Duma and the parliament. in the the late 90s into the early 2000s. And then we have the emergence of the United Russia Party. This is Putin's party and Medvedev's party, and they are just sweeping the elections. I mean, they have youth camps, I mean, that have been coming under criticism recently, but I mean, it's almost like they're, people are saying it's like the Soviet young pioneers, and the, it's the sort of the indoctrination of youth and this single party state that's just risen out of popularity for this one party. And there are, claims about Putin's cult of personality. And I think people are saying, he's not a Soviet dictator that, is staying in power for 20 years. He's, he was elected his first term, after he was vice president and, came into power after Yeltsin had to resign. Or he was elected, he was reelected, served, his presidential term, and then his term limit was up. So he stepped aside. Dmitry Medvedev, took the position of president, and Putin was his right-hand man. Many say that, Medvedev was just sort of a puppet of Putin, which, in some cases is true and might not be true, but the idea is you still have this sort of two-man power unit that's controlling Russian politics. And that's still...
I have a quick question, because you're obviously more of an expert on this. So, are there term limits on the presidency in Russia? Because I know, I think it expires for Putin, right, after this one? Or am I wrong about that?
I believe so, yeah. It's the same as the American presidency. You're limited to 2 terms of 4 years each, but that doesn't stop you from coming back and running again. And that's the concern.
Oh, so it's basically it's more of a consecutive limit,
Right, you can't serve a 3rd consecutive term, but Putin's on his 4th term. And there was a break in between the 2.
But he can't run again, at least in the next election. Right?
Not in the next election. He'd have to take another break. And,
but he could run after that.
He could run after that, yes.
That's an interesting system.
Yeah, coming out of the 90s and Yeltsin, it was a really sort of tumultuous period in Russian history. People just they wanted stability. They needed a strong man like Putin, and there was a lot of it's a poor term, but propaganda. Sort of advertising Putin as a strong, dependable leader that's just going to advance Russia, and that's sort of what spurred the popularity of his party, United Russia. Now people, they're becoming more confident with the Russian economy. Well, I mean, there's not a whole lot of confidence, but it's certainly better than the Russian mafia running 80% of the businesses in Russia. So people are starting to become more critical, and they're demonstrating or they're protesting his re-election, and his response as of recently or in 2012 put them in jail, put them on trial.
Yeah, I agree. My guess, I mean, there's things that could change. But my guess is in the next election, the people are going to choose. I'm assuming that the elections aren't rigged. I mean, there's probably some bias, but at least there's some legitimacy to the vote. So if assuming that happens, I think they're actually going to elect a pretty liberal person, at least compared to Putin. I think that's from what I'm reading. They're sort of tired of this sort of old way system that Putin and Medvedev had, and Medvedev was pretty moderate when he ran. There weren't as many protests, I would say, but I think the people are looking for someone who's pretty different from Putin, and I think that's likely to make them go to a more left wing perspective. Well, what do you think?
It's possible. I mean, it's certainly in the U.S. People are more politically involved than they are in Russia. Before the Soviet Union, it was just Tsarist Russia. There was a monarchy. Your political views didn't matter, unless you were a political dissident, in which case you could be thrown in jail or, whatever the police felt like doing to you. In the Soviet Union, it was a single-party system, and, the Communist Party always won. Yeah. So there wasn't much point in voting or expressing your political views. In fact, many people consciously withheld their political views, for obvious reasons, the repression, secret police. Yeah. People like Putin who would come and find them. So the older generations are not as politically inclined, or if they are, they vote, and the majority of those votes are for United Russia, Putin's party. Among the younger generations, there's, I'd say, more political activity, but still definitely not to the extent that we see in the U.S. And because the idea in Russia the sort of general sentiment in Russia is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of mistrust of Russian politicians, and especially in the 90s, all the corruption with businessmen and politicians, from the Soviet period into especially the 90s were just rampant corruption. It was a really horrible time for Russia. So I wouldn't be surprised if Putin came back again eventually, if things start to go downhill again. But I think you definitely have a point that if people are feeling more comfortable protesting and they're not happy with how he's responding to the protests, it's definitely possible that we'll see a more liberal leader come out of this, or a much softer leader come out of this.
Well, at least we know for sure it will be a different leader because he is term limited. But yeah, you're right. It's interesting to see what will happen. So talking about sort of the things Putin is doing, I think it's sort of reflecting sort of the more conservative social side. Russia's a pretty non-religious country, at least under the Soviet Union officially, but now, there's growing Catholicism and Christianity, and of course, the whole issue with Pussy Riot and that church, and then they got jailed, and then the anti-LGBT violence. It seems like there's a lot of crackdowns. I just want to hear your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, in terms of the LGBT crackdowns, I think after the Soviet Union, the Russian people really, had a very deep sense of Soviet identity. But what the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fracture into all the Istan states, in Central Asia, and the break of into, was it like 17 republics of the Soviet Union or something. People needed to find a Russian identity or something to rally around. And Putin has advocated, in public speeches pretty recently, actually. I think only a couple weeks ago he made a speech that Russia should rally around the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's sort of people say that they're Russian Orthodox in name and sort of adopt these principles as their own, even if they're not active churchgoers, which I would say is the majority. So that's, you think about the Russian Orthodox Church. It's an old institution, it's an old institution with conservative values and conservative ideas of marriage and things like that, combined with politically apathetic people who are only adopting these principles because they have a lost sense of identity. You understand where people. The people would be opposed to these LGBT demonstrations.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, and obviously you have many Russians participating in these sort of some of the violence. I mean, it's sort of a loose connection to former Confederacy. People saying the South will rise again, and some of their values. We have the whole Christian coalition in the whole United States, and they're the ones spewing a lot of the anti-LGBT sentiments. Here in the U.S., of course, not to the degree of severity. In Russia, of course, but I think eventually these jailing up. Let's talk more about political prisoners, but I think the jailing up of political prisoners over time is just gonna, cause some serious backlash for Putin because, I think public tide has slowly been turning against him with that. With people expressing their views, and the whole idea is when they opened up, they would be and. Going back to the whole idea, it's very Cold War-esque, and people are very skeptical of that.
Definitely. I mean, whenever you hear Russia has a crackdown on anything, it could be a crackdown on drug trade or something, and people are saying, oh, they're becoming a more authoritarian state. Look at all the police, all these, it's like the media that we're exposed to in the U.S. It's Russian tanks on the Kazakh border, trying to stop poppy seeds from coming in or something like that. But with the LGBT, you see the protesters with the police and their riot shields beating these protesters. And I mean, that's not necessarily something that's unknown in the U.S. I mean, it happens in the U.S., but it comes back to the sort of stigma of the strong Russian state, these big police officers beating down these people who just want their freedom. It's all very sort of poetic to the American
Yeah.
viewer.
Yeah. So I guess I'll ask for something more optimistic. So what do you think are some solutions? Because it just as deep. I mean, we're being realistic. I mean, we're talking the actual facts. But what do you think are some solutions that Russia, either the government or the people, or maybe the international community, could do? To promote.
So we're not just getting these pictures of these bloody protesters.
Yeah.
That's a tough question. I think as an American studying U.S. foreign policy, I'm very hesitant to tell Russia what it should do and what it should not do.
Yeah, the white man's word.
Right, or it's not even that. It's just the U.S. and it's
you're the global policeman of the world.
Exactly, its tendency to reach into. I mean, the U.S. with LGBT issues hasn't exactly been any more progressive than than Russians.
Although I mean, with growing gay marriage, and there's a lot more. I'd say at least you're not beaten in the street. For the most, at least by the government.
Yeah, the police are not beating protesters.
Yeah.
It's we have
that happened in the
'60s,
but at least we're somewhat better now.
Right, we're much more civilized now. We're past those dark times. So yeah, I think it's not the U.S. It's not the place of the U.S. to try to step in and tell Russia, you need to stop beating your protesters and be more accepting of your LGBT community. I think it's really sort of a change that's going to have to come within among the Russian people, sort of adaptation of this strict adherence to these vague ideas of Russian orthodoxy. I mean, it's a social change. It's become a social change in the U.S. It's not something that the federal government is
imagine
pressing.
It's more like in the U.S. It's more of a generational issue, or I'd imagine the younger generations are probably more in support of LGBT rights.
Yeah.
And over time, as the older generations die off, at least in that sense, they'll become more liberal, or at least they'll promote more of the human rights and stuff. So it'll take some time, and I guess the U.S. is also going through that same change.
I'd say that's true. I mean, if you look at the people who are in the protests in the U.S. and Russia, in the LGBT protests and rallies, you'll see not many people over 40 years of age. I mean, maybe that's because they're the people that are older working longer jobs, or you just have a bunch of rowdy college students that want to go protest something.
Yeah.
But in both cases, you're looking at a younger generation coming up. And in Russia, it's interesting because this whole sense of the Russian Orthodox identity is new to everyone. Even people that were born in the Soviet Union, it's new to them. So it's learning how to sort of adapt to this new identity and how to.
And imagine there's also some religious tension too, just very briefly, and then we can conclude. With the whole Chechnya and the Muslim situation going on there as well, because I know there's been a lot of conflict between more of the Christian community in Russia and some of the Muslim population. Because I think isn't that their second? If you count Christianity as one thing, is Islam the second largest religion in Russia? From what I know,
it is. Yeah, primarily in the southern republics of in the Caucasus region.
Yeah,
and Islam has become, or a Muslim has become, essentially synonymous with a person from the Caucasus, or synonymous with terrorism. And and especially, I actually just wrote an entire. I say entire. It was a short research paper, a comparative analysis of treatment of Muslim minorities in the U.S. versus Russia.
Oh, interesting.
And there's definitely a lot of tension between Muslims and Orthodox Christians in Russia, and it's not even related to religious ideology or anything of that sort. It's just Russians identifying themselves as being a Russian Orthodox nation, and therefore, I don't know, I guess by their interpretation, inherently opposed to Islam. And the same goes from the opposite. The Muslims see themselves as, inherently opposed to orthodoxy.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a growing problem. And it's also the whole, Chechnya separation movement, too, and some of the sort of mini civil war that's been going on, brewing for decades. So that's very interesting stuff. So I'll let you give any concluding remarks, and then I'll just give a brief conclusion.
Yeah, I think the concern in the U.S. about any sort of Russian crackdown or resurgence of a strong central Russian government, it's a number of smaller well, I mean, you can't exactly call them small, but it's a number of incidents piled up on top of each other with, the U.S. and Russia negotiating over a potential proxy war in Syria. These political dissidents being tried in Russian courts, the LGBT, the crackdown. I think it's really just a number of things adding up that are concerning Americans.
Yeah, I agree. So this was a great podcast. So for those tuning in, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. So today we covered drones, the NSA, and sort of Russian politics. If you have any comments, questions, you disagree or agree with us, let us know. Comment, message us. This will be posted soon. I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. And Andrew, it's great having you
Yes,
on.
thank you.
Yeah, and I really learned a lot because obviously my knowledge of Russian politics is not that great, but you definitely gave a lot of insight. So I just want to say thank you again to Andrew for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Alex. It was fun.
Yeah, so that concludes our podcast for today, and everyone, hopefully you have a good day and good weekend.